Hi, everyone. Thank you to the conference organizers and my fellow presenters for including me in this session. My name is Kate Farley, and I'm a doctoral candidate in sociocultural anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. And my research focuses on the culture of harvesting wild American ginseng and other forest botanicals in central and southern Appalachia. So today I'm going to talk about what I call folk conservation methods, sometimes called good stewardship, for ensuring a sustainable harvest of American ginseng, and sometimes how these locally defined conservation methods can conflict with official regulations. And then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the implications of these conflicts for ginseng sustainability and for rural Appalachian livelihoods a bit more broadly. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, so my research focuses on the cultural dimensions of ginseng digging from the perspectives of individual ginseng dealers and diggers and growers. And my work here is part of a broader project that uses conflicts over ginseng conservation to help us understand some of the different assumptions and values concerning the appropriate human role in the non-human world among rural people in North America. And most of this research was conducted between 2018 and 2020, including a period when I lived full-time in Western North Carolina for about 16 months. And in this photo here, a ginseng digger in Virginia is showing me how he digs for ginseng. So I was often out in the field with my interlocutors. Research participants were recruited sometimes by word of mouth, sometimes through inquiries on social media. Turns out a lot of ginseng diggers really like Facebook. And I was based in Western North Carolina, but I also worked with people located in Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. So wild American ginseng has been commercially harvested, primarily for export to East Asia in Appalachia since the 18th century. It's also an important plant in many indigenous North American healing traditions, as well as in the Southern folk medicine. But the majority of ginseng that gets harvested is for commercial export. And ginseng can be cultivated on an industrial scale. Those roots are kind of smooth, almost carrot-like. A farmer might get maybe $20 a pound for them. Whereas wild roots, like the ones in this photo, they're kind of smaller, twisted, wrinkled. They've got this, what diggers call wild character. And that can sell for $600 a pound or more. Last year, prices were well over $800 a pound for dried ginseng. So since ginseng is so valuable, or at least wild ginseng is so valuable, hunting ginseng is a popular pastime as well as an income-generating opportunity in rural Appalachia, where formal jobs that pay a living wage are scarce. So it can be a supplement to other inadequate income sources. But since ginseng is a long-lived perennial that is very slow growing, can sometimes take 10 or 12 years until it produces enough viable seed to reproduce itself. So this combination of high commercial value and its slow-growing nature means that it's particularly susceptible to being harvested faster than it can replenish itself. Leading to the observation that populations of wild ginseng are declining. And this is exacerbated by habitat loss due to things like mountaintop removal mining, large-scale timber harvests, and road construction in rural Appalachia. So ginseng harvesting is regulated on a state-by-state basis. Usually, rules are developed and enforced by state departments of fish and wildlife, just like regulations that pertain to hunting deer as opposed to hunting plants. There are some small variations from state to state, but in general, roots can only be harvested after the season officially begins at the beginning of September. Plants must be at least 5 years old, or they have three compound leaves called prongs. The neck, the portion of the root that shows the scars of the previous year's above ground parts, must be retained in order to prove that the root is old enough to be legally harvested. Ripe seeds must be planted in the immediate vicinity of where the ginseng plant was harvested. In many states, you're not allowed to have ginseng seeds and ginseng roots in your possession at the same time. So many of these rules and regulations are routinely ignored or only have partial compliance. But there's a lot of parallels here with, if you're at all familiar with deer hunting, for instance. If you sort of think about the rules for deer hunting, the rules for ginseng are in many ways very similar. So the extensive regulations of the ginseng harvest exist side by side with a common narrative amongst conservationists and foresters that traditional Appalachian ginseng harvesting techniques are always exploitative. The assumption is that the Appalachian forest is a commons, and ginseng is then subject to the tragedy of the commons. People will always take all the plants they can find and damage ecosystems, either because they don't know any better or because they are greedy and don't care about the long-term health of the forest as long as they can make money in the short term. So there is truth in this, and I don't want to imply that there isn't. Rates of harvest are higher than what wild ginseng populations can sustain, and wild ginseng populations do seem to be decreasing in size. However, in my research with Appalachian ginseng harvesters and growers, I found a much more complex story than what this common narrative would seem to imply. So a great deal of ginseng is harvested using illegal practices in one way or another. Some estimates suggest that the majority of wild ginseng is harvested while trespassing or out of season or involves underage specimens. But many traditional harvesters also engage in a set of practices and attitudes that are collectively indexed by the term good stewardship, which you could think of as folk conservation methods. And I'll describe them in a little more detail on the following slide. So on this slide, I've summarized some of the main good stewardship practices that have been mentioned by my interlocutors. Though not all ginseng harvesters use all of these practices or agree that they're all necessary to be practicing good stewardship. And some of these good stewardship practices are in line with what is specifically required by legal regulations. So it includes things like immediately planting ginseng seeds after harvesting the plant, although some harvesters will argue that good stewardship requires much more specific seed planting practices than the regulations require. It involves avoiding harvesting plants that are either above or below a certain age. The official regulations only will address plants that are a minimum size, but often a lot of good stewards will avoid harvesting the largest plants, what they will refer to as the mother plants, because they produce large quantities of seed that can help replenish populations. At the same time, there are some other good stewardship practices that are not in line with what is permissible according to the official regulations. For instance, there's a common belief that if you remove what's called the neck, which contains the bud for the following year's above ground parts, and replant it, sometimes the entire ginseng plant will regenerate. This is not allowable under the official regulations. Often people will also take seeds out of the woods and replant them in a more easily accessible, more easily monitored location, for instance, near one's home. That is also often not allowable by the regulations, to take wild seeds from the woods and transport them to another location. The photo here is actually a person who he's holding a large bag of commercially obtained ginseng seed that he purchased from a farm in Wisconsin and had it shipped to him in Kentucky. And he's holding a ginseng seed planting device in his hand. So he is actually planning on taking these ginseng seeds to the woods and planting them himself. This is a very common practice amongst many ginseng harvesters who consider themselves good stewards. I repeatedly heard the term Johnny Appleseed of ginseng from several different people. This idea that they are going to spread seeds of ginseng and replenish the woods full of ginseng using seeds obtained from these commercial sources. And I find the near ubiquitousness of the term stewardship interesting, because of the relationships of care in the term that the term stewardship implies. Perhaps the most obvious here is the relation between the steward and the thing that he or she is caring for. So in this case, American ginseng and the Appalachian mountain woodlands more broadly. Yet the term stewardship also contains the notion of guardianship or caretaking on behalf of another. And so think about the historical origins of the term steward. The term originally referred to a trusted servant who cared for a lord's manor or estate, and subsequently the word steward has been used to describe all sorts of people who care for things on behalf of others. So think of wine stewards or financial stewards. So if someone is a good steward of ginseng, on whose behalf are they caring for the ginseng? Future generations? God? The more than human assemblage that we might refer to as the Appalachian forest? And a full discussion of the implications of this point is beyond the scope of this presentation, but I do plan to address it in future writing. So throughout my work with ginseng diggers in Appalachia, I consistently hear frustration that decision makers who develop rules and regulations do not adequately consult the diggers themselves. Regulations are often based on biological research, which some diggers say doesn't always accurately reflect what they're actually encountering out in the woods. On the other hand, to be fair, diggers can be hard to talk to. Many diggers are reluctant to talk to people perceived as affiliated with the government, even if they're incorrect in that assumption. That said, more communication with diggers about these various folk conservation or good stewardship practices in developing harvest regulations could lead to higher rates of compliance. Communication and education directly with diggers is also a promising strategy when the information is coming from somebody they trust. So not necessarily a government official or a outsider, somebody they perceive to be an outsider, but someone like a local ginseng dealer or an experienced digger. One of the broader challenges here is that good jobs that pay a living wage are simply unavailable in many parts of rural Appalachia, and digging ginseng can be an important income supplement. So one concern is that increased regulation will further exclude the poorest ginseng diggers while allowing people with land, money, and resources to be the ones who remain in the industry. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this brief presentation. My email address is listed on this slide. It is kbfarley@wustl.edu. And I welcome any questions or comments that you might have. So thank you very much.